Just moments before Shabbat, respected Rabbi David Cohen collapsed in his home. His heart stopped. Medics fought desperately to revive him, unaware that his soul had already crossed into another realm. What he experienced shattered everything he thought he knew. A devoted Jewish scholar, Rabbi David, had spent his entire life rejecting Jesus until he met him face to face beyond death. This wasn't just a near-death experience, it was a revelation so profound that it turned his entire world upside down. Who Rabbi David, as my name is David Cohen. I was born into an Orthodox Jewish family in Brooklyn, New York. From the moment I could walk, I was immersed in the rhythm of tradition, morning prayers with my father, Hebrew school in the afternoons, and long Shabbat dinners filled with deep discussions on Torah and Talmud. Faith wasn't just something we practiced, it was our very identity. It shaped every moment, every decision, every breath. By my early 20s, I knew I wanted to become a rabbi, not for prestige or power, but because the Torah had captured my soul. To me, it wasn't just scripture, it was divine architecture. Every letter, every pause, every law was infused with meaning. I believed the Torah was God's direct revelation to the Jewish people, and I made it my life's mission to study it deeply and teach it with accuracy and reverence. Years in yeshiva were spent memorizing not only the Torah, but also the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the writings of our sages. My teachers were men of great wisdom and discipline, and I followed in their footsteps with unwavering dedication. Eventually, I was ordained as a congregational rabbi, devoting my days to study, teaching, and guiding my community in faith and tradition. I loved my people. I loved our heritage. I carried the responsibility of passing down the covenant given to Abraham and reaffirmed through Moses. As for Christianity, I never mocked it. In fact, I had Christian friends growing up and admired their commitment to family and prayer. But to me, their faith was well-intended yet theologically misguided. I saw Jesus as a historical figure, a Jewish teacher whose message had been reshaped into a religion that veered from the truth. The Messiah, as I understood from Jewish teachings, was supposed to bring lasting peace, rebuild the temple, and restore the exiles, not die on a Roman cross. It simply didn't make sense. When Christians tried to talk to me about Jesus, I would listen politely but always decline further conversation. Occasionally, I'd offer a respectful counterpoint from the Torah, not out of hostility but to clarify our perspective. I wasn't anti-Christian, I just believed they were wrong. My faith in Judaism was deeply rooted, built on decades of study, prayer, and spiritual wrestling. I had spent my life seeking truth, or so I thought. I was a man of conviction, discipline, and sincerity. My devotion was real, and I never imagined that anything could shake it, until the day everything changed. The moment that transformed everything. My life followed a sacred rhythm passed down through generations. Every morning before sunrise, I would wrap tefillin around my arm and forehead, whispering the morning prayers with deep intention. Each word of the Shema, each blessing from the Amidah, was spoken not out of habit, but devotion. After prayer, I'd gather with a small group of men at our synagogue for Torah study before breakfast. These sessions sharpened my mind and deepened my awe of God's wisdom. I spent my mornings preparing lessons for the synagogue and guiding young students through complex Talmudic discussions, teaching them not just to recite, but to wrestle with the deeper meaning of the law. Afternoons were for counseling, helping a young couple navigate the laws of family purity, sitting with a grieving widow to recite psalms, or mediating disputes with wisdom and care. These moments grounded me. I wasn't just a scholar, I was a shepherd. At home, life was warm, yet simple. My wife, Miriam, was my anchor, steadfast, wise, and deeply spiritual. Every Friday evening she lit the Shabbat candles with tears in her eyes, a silent prayer rising with the flames. We raised our 3 children in faith, ensuring they knew the beauty of our heritage. Friday afternoons were special. The house transformed, clean, quiet, filled with the aroma of challah and roasted chicken. As the sun set, we gathered at the table, blessed the wine and bread, sang Shabbat songs, and dove into animated Torah discussions. It wasn't just tradition. It was life itself. I was certain, grounded in what I believed was unshakable truth. Until the moment I died, a life rooted in faith until everything changed. Faith wasn't just something I believed, it was my life. It was joy. To me, God's presence wasn't distant or abstract, it was woven into every detail of existence. The law was never a burden, but a gift. Every commandment, every halachic ruling was a way to draw closer to the divine. My worldview was deeply covenantal. We were a people with a mission, not chosen because we were superior, but because God had entrusted us with His word. I never needed proof of His existence. I saw Him in the birth of a child, in the rhythms of the calendar, in the very survival of our people. I didn't question the truth of the Torah. I lived it. Even when faced with theological debates about other faiths, especially Christianity, I stood firm. I believed they had misinterpreted our scriptures, misunderstood our prophecies. Jesus, to me, was not the Messiah. The Messiah would bring universal peace, rebuild the temple, and usher in the age of redemption. That hadn't happened. I wasn't searching for anything more. I didn't feel lost. I was at peace, certain I was walking in truth. The day everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring. I had just finished counseling a young couple preparing for marriage, guiding them through the complexities of the ketubah, family expectations, and the sacred responsibilities of building a Jewish home. I was heading home to prepare my Shabbat sermon, one I was especially excited about, centered on Parashat Vayikra and the meaning of sacrifice. But as I walked through the synagogue lobby, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. At first, I dismissed it, probably indigestion or maybe a pulled muscle. There was always stress before Shabbat, so much to prepare, so many people relying on me. But the tightness didn't fade. It spread, slowly at first, then suddenly, up into my shoulders, down my left arm. My breathing became shallow. I stopped, steadying myself against the wall. My vision blurred. Even then, I told myself it was nothing. I was only 52. I ate well, I exercised. I had no family history of heart disease. It couldn't be serious. Miriam was waiting for me at home, as she always did. The moment I walked through the door, she knew something was wrong. "You're pale," she said, concern flickering in her eyes. She stepped toward me. "What's wrong?" "Just a little pressure," I muttered, waving her off. "It'll pass." But she wasn't convinced. "Sit down, I'm calling the doctor." No, just give me a minute." I tried to straighten up to reassure her. But then, like a crashing wave, the pain surged through my chest. My knees buckled. I collapsed into a chair, clutching my chest. Miriam's expression shifted from concern to panic. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and called emergency services, her voice shaking but steady as she gave them our address. The next few minutes were chaos. My breathing became ragged. Sweat poured down my face. My entire body felt like it was folding in on itself. The pain wasn't sharp, it was crushing, like an iron weight pressing down on me. I wanted to pray, but I couldn't form the words. I wanted to tell Miriam I loved her, that I was sorry for anything left unsaid, but even that was beyond me. The paramedics burst into the house, moving quickly. I could hear their voices, but they seemed distant, as if coming from underwater. One of them leaned over me. "Sir, can you hear me?" I tried to nod, but my body wouldn't respond. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of Miriam. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and then the light and presence. Everything faded, the pain, the noise, the light, just silence, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I felt weightless, no pain, no fear, no sound, just stillness. At first, I thought I had blacked out. But then I noticed something strange. I wasn't just vaguely conscious, I was fully aware, more aware than I had ever been before. My senses were sharper, heightened, yet I couldn't feel my body. I wasn't lying down, I wasn't standing, I wasn't anywhere. And then I saw it. Below me, yes, below me, was a scene I should not have been able to witness. 2 paramedics hovered over a man lying on a stretcher in my dining room. One was pressing rhythmically on his chest, the other was shouting numbers, preparing defibrillator pads. It took only a moment to realize the man on the stretcher was me. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was confusion, deep, disorienting confusion. How was I seeing myself from above? How was I hearing the paramedics? Their voices crisp yet distant, like echoes in water. Then I saw her, Miriam, crouched in the hallway, hands covering her face, tears streaming, praying. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her I was here, that I was okay, or at least still aware. But when I tried, nothing came out, no voice, no sound. I tried to reach for her, to move closer, but there was no arm to extend, no body to shift. I was just there, a presence, watching, yet no longer part of that world. I looked down at my own body, pale, limp, lifeless. And for the first time I felt sorrow, not for myself, but for them, for Miriam, for my children, who didn't yet know what was happening, for the people still caught in the moment I had already left behind. And that's when I began to understand I wasn't in my body anymore, not metaphorically, literally. I don't know how long I remained there. Time itself felt meaningless, like I was existing outside of it, watching events unfold below me without any sense of urgency. The paramedics were working frantically. I saw them press the paddles to my chest. My body jolted violently from the shock. One of them muttered a curse under his breath. Another checked my pulse, shook his head, and started compressions again. "We're losing him," someone said. "No, you're not," I thought. "I'm right here. I haven't gone anywhere." But they couldn't hear me. They didn't even know I was watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And yet, strangely, I wasn't afraid. The panic that had gripped me moments ago faded, replaced by an eerie stillness, not comfort, just quiet. I wasn't fighting anymore. I wasn't even trying to hold on. I just watched. Then something began to change. The room around me started dimming. Not like a light being switched off, but as if reality itself was becoming less real. The urgency of the scene, the paramedics, the flashing ambulance lights, the desperation in Miriam's tear-streaked face began to blur, like a television slowly being muted, and I felt it, something drawing me away, not pulling, not dragging, just inviting. Somehow I knew I was crossing a threshold. Whatever came next, I was no longer tethered to the world I had known. Into the light. As I drifted further, my awareness expanded, and the details of my home, the walls, the furniture, the familiar hum of life dissolved like mist under the morning sun. And then I saw it. Or rather, I was in it, light. But not like any light I had ever seen. This wasn't sunlight. It wasn't from a lamp or a fire. It wasn't shining on anything. It was the space. It cast no shadows. It had no source. It wasn't just around me. It was in me, through me, part of me. And it was alive. That's the only way I can describe it. This light, had presence, not just brightness, but intelligence. It was warm, aware, welcoming. It pulsed, not like a flickering bulb, but like breath. And with every pulse, I felt something seep into me. Peace, clarity, love. Not just love as I had understood it before, but something purer, deeper, like being fully known and still completely embraced. It reached into every part of me, even places I hadn't realized existed. The fear that had gripped me moments ago melted. Even the sorrow I had felt looking down at my body, at Miriam's helpless cries. It was still there, but now, wrapped in something soft, like a parent cradling a weeping child. There was no sound, not in the way we know sound, but the space spoke, not with words, with knowing. And I felt it, clear as breath in my lungs, come closer. It wasn't a command, it wasn't even a question, it was simply an invitation. And it stirred something deep inside me. A pull, not forceful, not demanding, just irresistible. I hesitated, not from fear exactly, but from uncertainty. I had spent my entire life studying what comes after death. I had recited prayers, pored over texts, imagined what Gan Eden might be like. But this was beyond anything I had ever envisioned. This wasn't paradise as I had pictured it. This wasn't the soul's rest. This wasn't a heavenly courtroom. It was more. I had never doubted the existence of God, but I had always pictured him as distant, wrapped in mystery, in holiness so great we could never draw too near. Yet here, in this light, he wasn't distant. He was near, intimate. And that terrified me. Not because it was harsh, but because it was real. I could feel it looking at me. Not just at what I had done, but at who I was. Not judging, just knowing. And yet, even with everything laid bare, there was no condemnation, only invitation. Still I resisted. A small voice inside me, the voice shaped by years of Torah study, by careful interpretations, by lectures and laws and theological boundaries, whispered, "This doesn't fit, this isn't how it's supposed to be." But then, another voice, deeper, more honest. "This is truth. This is what you've been longing for." And I knew. It didn't contradict the God I had worshipped. It felt like his fullness, as if, all my life, I had been looking through veils, and now they were being pulled back. And then, I wasn't alone. I hadn't seen him yet, but I felt him, a presence, not separate from the light, but distinct within it. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Not impatiently, but with the calm certainty of someone who had always known this moment would come. The closer I moved to the light, the stronger the feeling grew. I wasn't just being welcomed, I was being called. And as I moved deeper into the light, the presence I had sensed began to take form. At first, it was just an impression, a silhouette behind a veil of radiance, but then the veil lifted, and he stood before me, majestic, yet not imposing, radiant, yet not blinding. The light didn't shine on him, it shone from him. His robe shimmered, flowing like a soft wind, glowing with a quiet, white fire. And his face. Even now I struggle to describe it. There was no flaw, no harshness. His features were strong, yet gentle, timeless, yet human. But it was his eyes that undid me, eyes that had known me forever. They looked past everything I had built up, past my learning, my confidence, my carefully constructed theology. They saw me, not in violation, but in love. Face to face with truth, his eyes held a kindness that undid me. A kindness that didn't just comfort, but broke me open. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I knew who he was, even though I didn't want to. I had spent years studying him from a distance, dismissing him, refuting the claims of those who followed him. I had built arguments, debated theology, crafted careful explanations, but standing before him now. There was no argument. There was no debate. Truth wasn't something spoken. It wasn't something I needed to be convinced of. I felt it, undeniable, inescapable, entire. This was Jesus. His name thundered through me, though no sound had been made. I recoiled, not in anger, but because something deep inside me shattered. Number. It can't be. My knees gave out. I collapsed, not because he forced me to, but because the weight of what I now understood was too much to bear. I had spent my life searching for truth. I had believed I had found it in the Torah, and in many ways I had, but now, standing in front of him, I saw it for what it was, a shadow of something greater, a voice like no other. He stepped closer, but he didn't look down at me. He knelt, and then he spoke. David. My name. Spoken in a way I had never heard before, not just with love, but with authority, as if he wasn't just calling me, but something in me. You have sought God your entire life, he said. You have loved him, served him, taught his word with devotion. Tears blurred my vision. My whole body shook. I wanted to speak, to explain, to defend, but no words came. You have been faithful, he continued, but you have not understood the fullness of his plan. The words pierced me, not with pain, but with truth. I felt exposed. I felt known. And yet I had never felt so loved. All my learning, all my certainty, all my confidence, none of it had prepared me for this. He wasn't angry. He wasn't here to shame me. He was here to reveal. You know the scriptures, he said. You have walked the path of obedience, but the Torah was never the destination. It was the signpost. His voice carried both sorrow and hope. You honored the covenant, he said, but the covenant pointed to me. My heart broke, not because I felt betrayed, but because I realized I had missed him, all those years, all those verses, all the prayers, and yet he did not reject me. He welcomed me. He saw everything I was, everything I wasn't, and still he drew me in. I wept. Not because I was condemned, but because I was being offered something greater than I had ever known. Truth, wholeness, fulfillment, and yet a small part of me still resisted. Why, I asked in my heart. Why now? Why me? He looked at me, his eyes burning with compassion. Because I love you, he said, and because you are ready to see. The vision. As I knelt before him, still trembling under the weight of his presence, the light around us shifted. It didn't fade, it deepened, grew richer. Then suddenly I was no longer just standing there. I was inside something, a vision, a moment beyond time. I found myself on a mountain top. Wind swept through my hair. I knew this place immediately, Mount Moriah. I saw Abraham, aged, steady, his face set with resolve. Beside him walked Isaac, young, unaware, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice. I had taught this passage hundreds of times, the test of faith, the ultimate obedience. But now I wasn't just reading a story. I was watching it unfold. I felt the tension in Abraham's heart. I heard Isaac's quiet trust. I saw the knife rise, and just before it fell, the angel cried out. Abraham stopped. A ram appeared, caught in the thicket. But then the scene shifted. Another hill, another sun. But this time there was no ram. I saw him, Jesus, carrying a cross, blood on his brow, body broken. But unlike Isaac, he wasn't unaware. He knew, and still he walked forward willingly. I gasped. The story of Isaac wasn't just a test. It was a foreshadowing. Abraham's son was spared, but God's own son wasn't. Before I could even process it, the vision shifted again. The wilderness. I saw the Israelites, sick, dying from venomous snake bites. Moses stood, lifting a bronze serpent high on a pole, commanding the people to look upon it and live. It had always been an odd story to me. Why would God ask them to look at the image of the very thing that harmed them? And then, overlaying the scene, I saw Jesus on the cross, arms stretched wide. A verse I had once read and ignored flashed through my mind. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. My mouth went dry, my chest tightened. These weren't coincidences, they weren't Christian reinterpretations. The connections were exact, precise, divine. Then came the prophets. I was shown a man beaten, bloodied, despised, his appearance so disfigured he was barely human. Isaiah 53. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. By his wounds we are healed. I saw it. Not symbolically, literally. Then, Zechariah, they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. That verse had always confused me. Who was this me? How could God be pierced? But now, I understood. It was him, Jesus. And then Psalm 22. I heard the words echo, "They have pierced my hands and my feet. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing." Every verse, every prophecy, every shadow in the Torah had been pointing to him all along. From shadows to substance. Everything was coming into focus. All the shadows I had spent my life studying, every prophecy, every symbol, every verse, now had substance. I had believed in the Torah, the prophets, the writings. I had taught them, cherished them, defended them. But somehow I had missed the thread that tied them all together. Him. Jesus wasn't contradicting the scriptures. He was fulfilling them perfectly. I turned to him, shaken. How could I not have seen it? His gaze held no accusation, only compassion. "Because you searched the scriptures," he said, "but you did not know the one they testified about." My knees buckled again. I was undone. He had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. And somehow I had missed him. The light around us shifted, not dimming but expanding, as if the very fabric of reality was being peeled back. I felt Jesus beside me, though he didn't speak. Instead, I knew what was happening. I was being shown something few ever see. Heaven. A glimpse of eternity. The moment I entered, I understood. This wasn't a place as we think of places. It was presence. Everything here was saturated with love, not the love we talk about on earth, fleeting, emotional, conditional, but something purer, deeper, consuming. It wasn't just around me, it was in me. It was in every thought, every movement, every breath, and the peace. Not just silence, but a stillness that sang. A kind of music that didn't come from instruments, but from existence itself. A harmony woven into the very structure of reality. I looked around and saw people. Not bodies as we know them, but beings of light and joy. They moved effortlessly, no longer bound by time or gravity. There was no sadness in their eyes, no regret on their faces. They were whole. That's what struck me most. Each one was fully known, fully loved. There was no pretense, no fear, no shame, just belonging. I saw relationships, people reunited, laughing, embracing without words. I felt their unity, not uniformity, but oneness, of purpose, of spirit. There was no competition, no ego, no need to prove anything. They were in perfect connection with each other and with the source of all things, and I felt him. God wasn't hidden here. He was everywhere, like a warm wind, unseen, yet felt in every fiber of my being. I turned to Jesus. His face was illuminated, not by the light of heaven, but in a way that made even this radiant realm seem brighter. He said, "This is not a prize. It is the fulfillment of love, a relationship brought to completion." He looked across the expanse, where people rejoiced in quiet harmony. "They are here not because they followed rules," he said, but because they knew me, because they received what was freely given. I stood, silent, overwhelmed. My entire life had been built on obedience, on discipline, on striving, and yet here I was witnessing a joy I had never imagined, a joy not earned by effort, but born out of relationship. They didn't earn this? I asked. No, Jesus said gently. They received it. He wasn't diminishing the law or the beauty of the Torah. He was showing me its destination. The law was never a ladder to climb. It was always a signpost pointing here. A part of me ached at the thought of leaving, but I knew there was still more to see. The absence of light. The warmth began to fade, not suddenly but slowly, like a fire burning down to embers. The music ceased, the harmony vanished, and then came the cold, not physical cold, but something worse, the absence of peace, the absence of presence, the absence of love. The very air, if this place even had air, felt heavy, thick with sorrow. I was no longer standing in radiance. I was in darkness, not mere blackness, but a suffocating shadow that pressed in from every side. It wasn't simply the lack of light, it was the rejection of it. At first, I could barely see. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out figures. They moved slowly, if they moved at all. Some were curled in on themselves. Others wandered in circles, grasping at things that weren't there. Their forms looked human, but dimmed, faded, like the outlines of who they once were. And their faces. It wasn't torment from an outside force. It was something worse. It was grief, regret, a sorrow so deep it couldn't be put into words. These souls weren't being punished by fire. They weren't chained in anguish. They were suffering from a separation they knew could have been avoided. A longing for the light, for the presence I had just left, and somehow they knew they had rejected it, not out of ignorance, but by choice. Jesus was beside me again. I felt his presence, but it was distant now, like a gentle whisper in a thunderstorm. "This is the reality of separation," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Not punishment, David, consequence." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. "They were loved," he continued, "each one, just like you, but love cannot force, it only invites, and love rejected becomes separation." I wanted to look away. I wanted to unsee what I was witnessing, but I couldn't. A woman stood near the edge of a great void. Her eyes locked on something far beyond it, perhaps the light I had seen. Tears streamed silently down her face. She reached forward again and again, as if trying to touch what she once knew. And others, they wandered aimlessly, as if searching for something that wasn't there anymore, a choice that echoes in eternity. Some kept repeating the same choices over and over. Others sat motionless, numb, lost, and still others wandered, searching for something they could never quite grasp. I felt a cry rising up inside me, not out of fear for myself, but for them. "How long?" I asked Jesus. "How long are they here?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Truth must be chosen. They would not receive it there, and they will not receive it here." I broke. My heart split in two. I had spent my life believing in justice, in consequences. But this was unbearable, not because it was unfair, but because it was final. The pain wasn't in flames or chains. It was in knowing what they had missed, and still choosing to remain apart. Jesus turned to me. His eyes were full of both compassion and grief. "This is why I came," he said quietly. "Not to condemn, but to save." And in that moment I understood. He wasn't angry at them. He wasn't condemning them. He had wept for them. And still, he wept, light after darkness. Then the darkness shifted, not suddenly, but like dawn breaking over the deepest night. The warmth of his presence returned, flooding me, and I wept, not from fear this time, but from the ache of what I had seen. Jesus stood beside me, silent at first, allowing the weight of it all to settle. And then, without a word, we moved. Not walking, but passing through something unseen, until we stood before what looked like an open scroll. But this was no ordinary scroll. It was alive, words lifted from its surface, glowing, shifting, as if etched in eternal fire. "The covenant," he said. "You have loved it, guarded it, lived by it." I nodded, still trembling. "And you were right to honor it," he continued, "because it is holy, but you were never meant to carry it alone." The scroll unfurled wider, and I saw the Torah before me again. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, then the prophets, the Psalms, the writings. And as I looked, something happened. Connections formed. Threads were being pulled tight. Genesis 22, Abraham and Isaac. Exodus 12, the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. Numbers 21, the bronze serpent lifted up. Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet. Isaiah 53, he was crushed for our iniquities. Zechariah 12, they will look on me, the one they have pierced. Each verse, each event, each prophecy, lit up with new meaning. These weren't random texts. They were pieces of a divine puzzle, one I had studied my entire life without seeing the full image. The fulfillment of the covenant. "I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets," Jesus said, his voice steady, "but to fulfill them." The words pierced me, not in condemnation, but like a sword cutting away blindness. I had always believed the covenant with Israel was eternal, that God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were unbreakable, and I still believed that, but now I saw what I had never understood. The covenant was not complete in itself. It was a beginning, a foundation, a path that pointed beyond itself, to Him. Every sacrifice, he said, every festival, every law, it all pointed forward, not to erase what came before, but to bring it to fullness. I struggled to breathe under the weight of the revelation. "All those years," I whispered, "I thought we were still waiting." "You were," he said gently, "and I came. But many did not recognize me, because they were looking for power, not love, a throne, not a cross." I thought of the prayers I had led on Passover, next year in Jerusalem, the cries for redemption, the longing for Messiah, and now I saw He had come, and I hadn't known Him. My heart felt torn in two, love and sorrow wrestling inside me. "I taught them to wait," I said quietly. "I told them He had not yet come." Jesus stepped closer, his eyes locking with mine. "And now I am showing you that He has," he said. "The covenant is not broken, it is fulfilled. The promises are not forgotten, they are complete." He placed a hand over his heart. "And you, David, you are loved. Your devotion was not in vain. It led you here." I covered my face and wept, not out of shame, but because for all my life I had defended what I thought was the whole truth, and now I saw it was only a part, a beautiful part, but not the end. And here he stood, the living Torah, the fulfillment of the law, the embodiment of everything I had ever hoped for, and I knew I could not return the same. The call, I stood before him, undone by everything I had seen, heaven and hell, light and darkness. The scriptures coming alive in ways I had never imagined. My heart was raw, but open. For the first time in my life, I wasn't clinging to my knowledge, I was simply listening. Jesus looked at me. No thunder roared, no lightning flashed, but I knew something monumental was about to be spoken. "You have been faithful," he said, his voice both strong and tender. You have loved God with all your heart, all your soul and all your strength. You have taught His word with sincerity and devotion. I felt the weight of those words. He wasn't erasing my past. He was honoring it. But then he continued, now you are being called to more. I didn't speak. I couldn't. You are to be a bridge, he said, between what was and what is, between the covenant you have lived and the fulfillment you have now seen. He let the words settle. There are others like you, he said. Others who love God deeply but do not yet see the fullness of His plan. You are to go to them, not to condemn but to reveal, to show them what you now know. The enormity of it sank in. Me, a rabbi who once, the call and the return, I had once dismissed him entirely, and now I was tasked with bearing witness to the very truth I had once rejected. But why me? I whispered. His eyes met mine. Because your heart is sincere, because you searched for God, not with pride, but with love, and because those who trust you will listen when you speak. I fell to my knees. I am not worthy, I choked out. No one is, he replied, but all are loved, and now you are sent. His words didn't erase my fear, but they gave me strength. I understood now, and this calling wasn't born out of guilt. It was born out of love, love for God, love for His people, love for the truth that had always been waiting. And so I said yes. The moment I did, truly, deeply, the atmosphere shifted, the light remained. But something moved, a pull, not away from Him, but backward, back toward the world I had left behind. It is time, Jesus said. What you've seen is not just for you, it must be shared. I didn't want to go. Every part of me longed to stay in that perfect presence, but I knew He was right. With one last look, He placed something in me, not physically, but spiritually. A clarity, a knowing, a fire I knew would never burn out. Then came the rush. I felt myself falling, not downward, but inward, like being pulled through layers of existence. The light dimmed, the warmth faded, the stillness replaced by noise, then pain, sharp, crippling. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I gasped, choking on air, my body convulsed, a blinding light above me, fluorescent, not holy, machines beeping, voices shouting, "He's back! Stay with us, Rabbi, stay with us!" Hands pressed against me, needles in my arms, cold pads on my skin. I was back in the hospital, back in the shell I had once left behind. The pain was overwhelming, not just physical pain, but emotional. The contrast between where I had been and where I was now felt unbearable, and yet I breathed. Each breath was ragged, shallow, but it was breath. I turned my head slightly. Miriam stood by my side, her hand gripping mine, her eyes swollen with tears. She whispered my name like a prayer. I wanted to speak, to tell her everything, but my throat was dry, my body too weak. All I could do was look at her. And in that look, I hoped she saw it, that I was alive, and that everything had changed. The weight of truth, the days that followed were quiet on the outside. But inside me a storm raged. I lay in that hospital bed surrounded by machines, life humming along as usual, while my soul tried to make sense of what I had seen. I knew what had happened. I knew who I had met. There was no denying it. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to speak. Not yet. Fear gripped me. Not fear of death. I had already crossed that line. But fear of what would happen if I told the truth. What would my wife think? My children, my students, my congregation? Would they call me mad, a traitor, a heretic? Every fiber of my identity had been built on my role as a rabbi, a teacher of Torah, a leader in my community. And now I had encountered the very one I had spent my life dismissing. What was I supposed to do with that? Guilt came in waves. Guilt for not having seen the truth sooner. Guilt for staying silent now. But the fear was louder. If I spoke, I might lose everything. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. My body still ached, but my heart ached more. Slowly, painfully, I sat up. I reached for the small wooden drawer beside my hospital bed. Inside, a book I had never opened. Not really. The New Testament. It had been given to me years ago by a well-meaning Christian acquaintance. Out of politeness, I had kept it. Out of pride, I had never touched it. Until now, my hands trembled as I opened the first page. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I kept reading, slowly, carefully, and there he was, not just the Jesus I had met in the light, but the Jesus I had read about in the prophets, now walking the earth, speaking, healing, teaching. Then I reached the Sermon on the Mount, and I read his words. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. It hit me like a wave. This wasn't a different religion. This was the continuation, the fulfillment of everything I had taught. The shadows were becoming substance, and I knew I couldn't stay silent much longer. The first confession. When I returned home, everything looked the same. The dining table, the shelves filled with Torah commentaries, the mezuzah on the door, but I was not the same. I moved through my own house like a stranger in familiar skin. I knew what I had to do, but dread sat in my chest like stone. It started with my family. We gathered in the living room one evening. Miriam sat across from me, a cup of tea in her hands, untouched. My 3 children, now grown, sat quietly, worried, respectful, expectant. They had been patient with me since I came home from the hospital, but they could sense something was coming. I took a breath. I need to tell you what happened, I said. And then I told them everything, the light, the presence, the encounter with Jesus, the visions from the Torah, heaven, hell, the words he spoke to me, and as I spoke, I watched their faces shift. A moment of reckoning. My middle son, always the most outspoken, leaned forward, eyes sharp with disbelief. You're saying you believe in Jesus? The words hung in the air, heavy with years of tradition and expectation. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of my own confession. Yes, I said, finally, my voice steady but quiet. I met him. I didn't just hear about him, I saw him. And for the first time, I truly understood. He is the fulfillment of everything we've believed. Miriam's eyes welled with tears. She didn't speak, just studied me, as if trying to reconcile the man she had known for decades with the man now sitting before her. My daughter broke the silence. But what about the Torah? What about everything you taught us? I took a deep breath. It's still true, I said. But now I see the full picture. He didn't erase it. He completed it. It wasn't easy. There were tears. There were questions. Long silences filled the spaces between us, but they stayed. They listened. And somehow, they didn't walk away. The harder truth. The harder part came next, telling my congregation. That Shabbat morning, as I stood before them, my heart pounded in my chest. I looked out at the faces I had taught for years, people who trusted me, who had grown under my leadership. And I knew my words would change everything. I need to speak to you, I began, not as your rabbi, but as a man who almost died and came back, changed. And yet, I breathed. Each breath was ragged, shallow, but it was breath. I turned my head slightly. Miriam stood by my side, her hand gripping mine, her eyes swollen with tears. She whispered my name like a prayer. I wanted to speak, to tell her everything, but my throat was dry, my body too weak. All I could do was look at her. And in that look, I hoped she saw it, that I was alive, and that everything had changed. The weight of truth, the days that followed were quiet on the outside, but inside me a storm raged. I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines, life humming along as usual, while my soul tried to make sense of what I had seen. I knew what had happened. I knew who I had met. There was no denying it. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to speak. Not yet. Fear gripped me. Not fear of death. I had already crossed that line. But fear of what would happen if I told the truth. What would my wife think? My children, my students, my congregation? Would they call me mad, a traitor, a heretic? Every fiber of my identity had been built on my role as a rabbi, a teacher of Torah, a leader in my community, and now I had encountered the very one I had spent my life dismissing. What was I supposed to do with that? Guilt came in waves. Guilt for not having seen the truth sooner. Guilt for staying silent now. But the fear was louder. If I spoke, I might lose everything. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. My body still ached, but my heart ached more. Slowly, painfully, I sat up. I reached for the small wooden drawer beside my hospital bed. Inside, a book I had never opened. Not really. The New Testament. It had been given to me years ago by a well-meaning Christian acquaintance. Out of politeness, I had kept it. Out of pride, I had never touched it. Until now, my hands trembled as I opened the first page. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I kept reading, slowly, carefully, and there he was, not just the Jesus I had met in the light, but the Jesus I had read about in the prophets, now walking the earth, speaking, healing, teaching. Then I reached the Sermon on the Mount, and I read his words. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. It hit me like a wave. This wasn't a different religion. This was the continuation, the fulfillment of everything I had taught. The shadows were becoming substance, and I knew I couldn't stay silent much longer. The first confession. When I returned home, everything looked the same. The dining table, the shelves filled with Torah commentaries, the mezuzah on the door, but I was not the same. I moved through my own house like a stranger in familiar skin. I knew what I had to do, but dread sat in my chest like stone. It started with my family. We gathered in the living room one evening. Miriam sat across from me, a cup of tea in her hands, untouched. My 3 children, now grown, sat quietly, worried, respectful, expectant. They had been patient with me since I came home from the hospital, but they could sense something was coming. I took a breath. I need to tell you what happened, I said. And then I told them everything, the light, the presence, the encounter with Jesus, the visions from the Torah, heaven, hell, the words he spoke to me, and as I spoke, I watched their faces shift. A moment of reckoning. My middle son, always the most outspoken, leaned forward, eyes sharp with disbelief. You're saying you believe in Jesus? The words hung in the air, heavy with years of tradition and expectation. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of my own confession. Yes, I said, finally, my voice steady but quiet. I met him. I didn't just hear about him, I saw him. And for the first time, I truly understood. He is the fulfillment of everything we've believed. Miriam's eyes welled with tears. She didn't speak, just studied me, as if trying to reconcile the man she had known for decades with the man now sitting before her. My daughter broke the silence. But what about the Torah? What about everything you taught us? I took a deep breath. "It's still true," I said. "But now I see the full picture." He didn't erase it. He completed it. It wasn't easy. There were tears. There were questions. Long silences filled the spaces between us, but they stayed. They listened. And somehow, they didn't walk away. The harder truth. The harder part came next, telling my congregation. That Shabbat morning, as I stood before them, my heart pounded in my chest. I looked out at the faces I had taught for years, people who trusted me, who had grown under my leadership. And I knew my words would change everything. "I need to speak to you," I began, "not as your rabbi, but as a man who almost died and came back, changed." I told them the truth about my near-death experience, the light, the presence, the visions. And then I spoke the words I knew would divide the room. I met Jesus, and I now believe he is the Messiah our scriptures have pointed to all along. Gasps. Silence. A few murmurs. Some shook their heads. Some wept. Some stood and walked out. But others stayed, their eyes locked on mine, not with anger, but with searching. In the back of the room, a skeptic I had debated with for years had tears on his face. I didn't try to convince them. I didn't argue. I simply told them what I had seen. "I still love the Torah," I assured them. "My Jewish identity hasn't died. It has expanded. I haven't left the covenant. I have seen its fulfillment." It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most honest. And in that honesty, something began to shift, not quickly, not neatly, but genuinely. A new way of seeing life. After that moment of truth didn't get easier, it got clearer. I no longer saw the Torah and the Gospel as separate stories, they were one. The law I once saw as the path to righteousness, I now saw as the map that pointed to the only one who could fulfill it. Every time I opened the scriptures, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, I read with new eyes. Where I once saw commandments, I now saw promises. Where I once saw shadows, I now saw substance. Isaiah 53 brought me to tears. Psalm 22 spoke with eerie precision. Even the rituals, Passover, Yom Kippur, the sacrifices in Leviticus, took on new life when seen through the lens of Jesus. He didn't cancel what came before. He completed it, and he changed me. The cost and the calling. I began to speak, not to argue, but to invite. At first, in small groups, then at interfaith events. I shared my story not as a theologian, but as a man who had once thought he had all the answers until he met the one who was the answer. Some welcomed me with open arms, others, not so much. There was backlash. Former colleagues cut ties. Some in the Jewish community called me a traitor, a sellout, a false teacher. I don't hold it against them. I understand their pain, their confusion. I was once in their shoes. It took a literal encounter with death for me to see what I had been blind to. But for every door that closed, another opened. I met countless others, Jews, Christians, seekers of all kinds, who felt caught between two worlds. To them I say this: there is no contradiction between loving the God of Israel and following his Messiah. Jesus is not the abandonment of Judaism. He is its fulfillment. A family transformed. My wife Miriam, who once sat in stunned silence as I spoke of that heavenly light, now prays with me as we read the New Testament together. My children, once skeptical, are beginning to ask deeper questions. We don't rush the journey. Truth isn't forced, it's revealed, and that's what I feel called to do now. Not to push, not to persuade, but to reveal, to be a bridge between the Torah and the Gospel, between the law and grace, between people and their Messiah. Living in the tension, I've learned to live with the tension, with the questions, with the cost. Truth is rarely convenient. It doesn't always fit into our boxes or traditions, but it frees us, it heals, it completes. Yes, there are moments when I feel the weight of what I've lost, community, status, certainty. But those are shadows compared to the light I've seen. I wouldn't trade my encounter with Jesus for anything. He changed everything, so I speak. As often and as clearly as I can, to churches, synagogues, online forums, small living rooms, not because I need to be believed, but because I owe it to the one who met me when I should have died, the one who gave me a second chance, not just at life, but at truth. A final word, if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, I want to leave you with this. Seek truth. Even when it threatens everything you thought you knew, even when it costs you comfort, reputation, or community. Because truth is worth it. And when you find it, not just as an idea, but as a person, everything will change. Just like it did for me.